April 23, 1014 AD, Good Friday, Clontarf, north of Dublin. Picture this: the sun rises on the holiest day in Christendom, casting long shadows across the coastal plain north of Dublin. An old man, 73 years of age, kneels in his tent praying while 7,000 Viking warriors backed by 4,000 Irish rebels prepare to end his dream of a united Ireland. The mathematics are brutal. 5,000 Irish warriors, farmers, fishermen, minor nobility with leather armor and small throwing spears, face an international coalition of professional killers equipped with chain mail, double-edged swords, and 2 centuries of terror behind them. The Vikings have come from the Orkney Islands, from the Isle of Man, from settlements across the Irish Sea. They've brought their dragon ships, their battle axes, their reputation for invincibility. This is the story of how Brian Boru, the first man to truly call himself High King of all Ireland, staked everything on a single day's battle. And here's what historians don't tell you: he won the battle but lost his life. His son died. His grandson drowned in armor, thrown against a fishing weir by the incoming tide. And yet, that bloody Good Friday on the shores of Clontarf broke Viking power in Ireland forever, and transformed a fragmented island into a nation that remembered itself as one people. This wasn't Christian versus pagan. This wasn't even really Irish versus Viking. This was something far more complex, far more brutal, and far more fascinating: a civil war fought with international mercenaries on both sides, where the final casualty count would read like a royal obituary: between 7,000 and 10,000 dead, including almost every single leader who fought that day. Let me show you how it happened. The architect of empire. To understand Clontarf, you need to understand Brian Boru, and to understand Brian, you need to know what Ireland was before him. In the year 941 AD, when Brian was born in Kincora, near present-day Killaloe in County Clare, Ireland wasn't really Ireland. It was a patchwork of warring kingdoms, tribal territories, and Viking settlements that had been fighting each other for over 200 years. The country was divided by tradition, conquered by ambition, and terrorized by Northmen who had turned coastal raiding into permanent occupation. Dublin was a Viking city. Waterford was a Viking city. Limerick was a Viking stronghold. The Norse hadn't just raided Ireland, they'd moved in, built towns, minted coins, established trade networks, married Irish women, and created a hybrid Norse-Irish culture that was neither fully one nor the other. For centuries, the High Kingship of Ireland had been the exclusive property of the Nael dynasty from the north. They controlled the kingship of Tara, the symbolic seat of Irish power, and they treated the southern kingdoms like subordinate territories. The Dál G Kais, Brian's people, were nobodies, a minor clan in Clare, considered barely more than cattle raiders by the northern dynasties. Brian's father, Senatig mac Lorcain, had elevated the family to become kings of Thomond, but it was Brian's older brother Mathgamain who first challenged the old order by claiming the kingship of all Munster in the 970s. When Mathgamain was betrayed and murdered in 976 by the rival Eoganach dynasty working with Viking allies, Brian didn't just avenge him, he systematically dismantled every enemy who had conspired in the killing. He claimed Munster, then turned his eyes northward. Here's where Brian showed his genius. He didn't fight Vikings because they were Vikings. He allied with Vikings when it suited him, married his daughter to the Viking king of Dublin, and used Viking warriors in his own armies. What Brian understood, what made him different from every Irish king before him, was that power wasn't about bloodlines or tradition. It was about control, about loyalty, about making deals, breaking enemies, and building something larger than tribal revenge. Between 976 and 1002, Brian transformed himself from a minor clan chieftain into the master of southern Ireland, defeated the traditional northern dynasties, and forced Mael mac Domhnall, the Nael High King, to surrender the High Kingship without a final battle. In 1002, at the age of 61, Brian Boru became the first southern king to hold the title of High King of Ireland in living memory. But holding the title wasn't the same as holding the power. The seeds of rebellion. For 12 years, Brian worked to make his high kingship real. He led military expeditions into Ulster and Connaught. He forced the northern dynasties to give him hostages, sons of kings held as guarantees of good behavior. He allied himself with the church, particularly the monastery at Armagh, which claimed spiritual authority over all of Ireland through its connection to St. Patrick. The monks at Armagh even wrote in the Book of Armagh that Brian was Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Irish. But empire building creates enemies, and by 1012, Brian had plenty. First, there was Mael Morda mac Murchada, King of Leinster, who had initially submitted to Brian's rule but grew to resent being anyone's subordinate. According to legend, the final break came over a game of chess and a snide comment, but the real cause was deeper. Leinster had always been independent, and Mael Morda saw no reason to bow to a Clare upstart. Second, there was Sigurd Silkbeard, the Viking king of Dublin. Sigurd was Brian's son-in-law, married to Brian's daughter Slain, but family ties meant nothing when political survival was at stake. Dublin was wealthy, cosmopolitan, the economic heart of Viking Ireland. Sigurd had no intention of letting Brian's dream of unified Irish kingship destroy Viking independence. In 1012, the alliance formed. Mael Morda and Sigurd began raiding territories loyal to Brian. They attacked Meath, the territory of Mael Sechnaill, Brian's former enemy turned reluctant ally. When Sigurd sent a Viking fleet to raid Cork in Munster, Brian knew this wasn't just rebellion, it was war. In 1013, Brian brought his army to Dublin and laid siege to the city. For 3 months, from September to the end of December, the High King's forces camped outside the walls, raiding the surrounding countryside, burning settlements from Fine Gaul to Howth, but they couldn't take the city itself. Dublin's walls were strong, and Sigurd had time to do something unprecedented. He sent messengers overseas to recruit an international Viking army. Think about what this means. By 1014, the Viking age was supposedly winding down. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark had conquered England. The great age of Viking expansion was ending, settling into organized kingdoms and Christian conversion. But Sigurd's call went out to the old warriors, the ones who still remembered when a Viking fleet meant terror and treasure. And they answered. The impossible odds, an international army of death. Sigurd Silkbeard wasn't just recruiting mercenaries, he was assembling an all-star roster of Viking warfare. From the Orkney Islands came Sigurd H. Lodverson, called Sigurd the Stout, the Earl of Orkney. Sigurd controlled the Northern Isles and the Hebrides, territories that made him one of the most powerful Viking leaders in the British Isles. According to the Icelandic Engil's saga, written 2 centuries later, but drawing on oral tradition, Sigurd promised Sigurd the high kingship of Ireland itself if Brian was defeated. He also offered him his mother Gormflaith as a bride. Whether Sigurd believed the promises or simply saw an opportunity for plunder and glory, he brought his professional warriors, men who fought in mail armor with Danish axes and long swords. From the Isle of Man came Brodia, a warrior described in Irish chronicles as leading a fleet of Viking ships. Some sources claim Brodia had once been a Christian convert who had apostatized, abandoned his faith, and returned to the Old Norse gods. Whether that's true or propaganda, Brodia brought hardened fighters who had raided the Irish Sea for years. The Viking warriors came with their traditional equipment, chain-mail hauberks that could turn a sword's stroke, round shields painted with clan symbols, long axes that could split a man from shoulder to waist, and the legendary Viking fighting technique, the shield wall. These men fought in tight formation, shields overlapping, creating a mobile fortress that ancient and medieval armies struggled to break. Add to this the 4,000 warriors from Leinster under Mael Morda, Irish fighters who knew the terrain, who had their own axes and swords, who had been fighting against Brian's expansion for years, and you have a coalition army of approximately 7,000 men. Against them, Brian Boru had 5,000 warriors. Let's break down the mathematics of doom. Brian's army, 4,900 men consisting of 2,000 from Munster, 1,400 Dalcassians, Brian's own clan, and 1,500 from Connaught. These were mixed-quality troops. The Dalcassians were experienced, loyal, and well-equipped. The Munster and Connaught contingents were tribal levies, farmers who could fight, minor nobility, men who brought leather armor and short spears rather than mail and swords. The coalition army, 7,000 men, including 3,000 professional Viking warriors in mail armor with superior weapons, plus 4,000 Leinster troops who were defending their homeland. The wildcard, Mael Morda of Leinster, the former High King, brought his Meath army to the muster. Some sources say he had 1,500 men, but here's the controversy that historians still debate. Mael Morda may have made a secret deal with the Dublin forces not to engage. He might have stood aside and watched to see who won. We know his forces suffered almost no casualties, which in a battle this brutal is deeply suspicious. So the real mathematics were potentially worse. 5,000 committed fighters facing 7,000 enemies, with possibly 1,500 allies who were there in body but not in spirit. Brian knew the odds. At 73, he'd been fighting for nearly 40 years. He'd won against worse odds before. At the Battle of Glenmama in 999, his forces had routed the combined armies of Leinster and Dublin. But he was old now, too old to fight on the front lines. His son Murchad, a warrior in his prime, would lead the battle. His 15-year-old grandson Twadalbach would fight alongside his father. And Brian would stay in his tent behind the lines, praying to the Christian God on the holiest day of the year, asking for one more miracle. Good Friday dawn. The battle was set for Friday, April 23, 1014, Good Friday, the day Christians commemorated Christ's crucifixion. For Brian, a deeply religious man who had built churches and supported monasteries, choosing to fight on this sacred day must have been agonizing. But the timing wasn't his choice. The tide was. The battlefield was Clontarf, a coastal plain just north of Dublin, between the Liffey and Tolka rivers. The Dublin-Leinster coalition had marched out to meet Brian's army, and the Viking fleet lay at anchor in Dublin Bay. According to the Cogad Gidal Re Galeb, the War of the Irish with the Foreigners, a propagandistic Irish account written decades later, the battle was timed with the tides. High tide at Clontarf that day would occur around 5:30 in the morning and again around 5:55 in the evening, a detail confirmed by 19th-century tidal calculations that matched the medieval accounts with eerie precision. As dawn broke on Good Friday, both armies were drawn up for battle. The coalition battle line, according to the Cogad. Front rank, the foreign Vikings under Brodia, Sigurd, and a warrior named Platt, described as the bravest knight of all the foreigners. These were the shock troops, the professional killers in their chain mail, carrying their long axes and swords. Second rank, the men of Dublin under Dubgall Mac Amlabe, Sigtrygg's brother, and Gilla Kirain Mac Glun Ian. These were Norse-Irish warriors, Vikings who had been in Ireland for generations, fighting for their city's independence. Third rank, the Leinster men under Mael Morda. These were Irish warriors fighting for their provincial king and their traditional rights against Brian's imperialism. Sigtrygg himself stayed on Dublin's walls with his wife slain, Brian's own daughter, watching the battle that would determine whether her father or her husband's allies would control Ireland. Brian's battle line. Front rank, the Dáil G. Kais under Murchad Mac Brian, his 15-year-old son Twadalbach, Brian's brother Cuduilig, and Domnall Mac Daramata. These were Brian's best warriors, his clan's elite fighters. Second rank, the rest of the Munster forces under regional kings. Third rank, the Connaught warriors under Mael Ruinade Ua H. Eidhin and Tad Ua Selig. Left flank, Viking allies. Yes, Brian had Viking mercenaries fighting for him, and Irish warriors under Fergal Ua Ruyik. Rear, possibly Mael Morda and the men of Meath, whose loyalty was about to be tested. Behind all of them, in a tent set back from the battle lines, knelt Brian Boru, too old to fight but too proud to flee, praying for his men, his family, and his dream of Ireland. The battle would last from sunrise to sunset, approximately 12 hours of continuous, brutal close-quarters combat, and it would begin, as so many medieval battles did, with a gesture of individual valor that was really just a prelude to mass slaughter. The champions' duel and the opening slaughter. According to the Cogad Gidal Re Galeb, The battle opened with a formal challenge. A Viking warrior named Platt, described as the bravest of all the foreign fighters, stepped forward and taunted Domhnall Mac Iman, a Scottish warrior who had come to fight for Brian. This wasn't unusual. Medieval battles often began with champion duels, single combats designed to boost morale and test the courage of heroes. Domhnall accepted the challenge. The two men walked out into the space between the armies. They fought with swords, and according to the chronicle, they both died in a moment of perfect mutual slaughter, with the sword of each through the heart of the other and the hair of each in the clenched hand of the other. Think about that image. Two men locked together in death, hands clutching the other's hair even as their hearts stopped beating. It's the kind of detail that makes you believe someone actually witnessed it, too specific, too visceral to be completely invented. And then the real killing began. The battle lines collided with a sound that witnesses described as deafening, the crash of shield on shield, the screaming of wounded men, the war cries in Irish, Norse, and Gaelic mixing into a cacophony of violence. This wasn't formation fighting like Roman legions or Macedonian phalanxes. This was the brutal, grinding combat of the early medieval period, where battles were won by stamina, courage, and the willingness to keep killing when your arms were tired, and your shield was splintered, and your friends were dying beside you. The Irish secret weapon. Here's something the popular imagination gets wrong. Brian's forces weren't hopelessly outmatched in equipment. Yes, the Vikings had mail armor. Yes, they had better swords, but the Irish had developed a tactical counter, small throwing spears. These weren't the heavy javelins of Roman legions or the throwing axes of Frankish warriors. These were light, short-range spears designed for one purpose, to be hurled in volleys at close range into packed enemy formations. The Vikings' mail could stop a sword stroke, but a thrown spear coming down at an angle that could punch through mail rings or, more likely, hit exposed faces, necks, and limbs. The Irish used these throwing spears in waves. Advance to throwing range, hurl your spears, draw your swords, charge into the disrupted enemy formation. It was effective enough that the Vikings, who had fought everyone from the Franks to the Byzantines, found themselves being slowly pushed back. Murchad's rampage. At the front of Brian's army, Murchad mac Brian, Brian's son, the heir to the high kingship, led the Dál G Kais against the Viking front line. The Cogad Gidal Re Galab credits him with personally killing 100 Viking warriors, 50 with the sword in his right hand and 50 with the sword in his left. Now that's obviously exaggeration. No one kills 100 men single-handedly in battle, but the detail tells us something true. Murchad was a beast. He was the kind of warrior who leads from the front, whose personal courage inspires his men to push forward when everything in their exhausted bodies is screaming to retreat. Ancient and medieval warfare hinged on leaders like this, men whose valor kept their formations intact long enough to break the enemy's will. The battle fragmented into smaller, desperate struggles. The Connaught warriors collided with the men of Dublin in a battle within a battle so fierce that, according to the annals, only 100 Connaught men and 20 Dublin men survived. These weren't formations doing controlled advances. This was chaotic, murderous close combat where men hacked at each other until one side or the other broke. The tide turns, drowning in victory. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher on Good Friday, and still the armies fought. Men fought until their shields broke, then fought with swords. When swords dulled or broke, they fought with axes. When axes were lost, they fought with daggers and fists and teeth. And slowly, incrementally, Brian's forces gained the advantage. It wasn't a single breakthrough or a clever flanking maneuver. It was the brutal arithmetic of attrition combined with numerical superiority at key points. The Irish throwing spears kept finding targets. The Vikings' mail armor, effective against swords, couldn't protect faces and throats and the backs of knees. The coalition forces, fighting for pay and promises, started to break against the Irish warriors fighting for their high king and their homeland. By late afternoon, the Dublin-Leinster line began to fracture. The Vikings, realizing the battle was lost, tried to retreat to their ships anchored in Dublin Bay. And here's where the tide, the literal ocean tide, became the decisive factor in one of medieval Europe's most important battles. Remember that calculation: high tide at 5:30 a.m., low tide around midday, high tide again at 5:55 p.m. The battle had started at first light with high tide. The Viking ships had been close to shore, ready for quick escape if needed. But as the battle raged through the middle of the day, the tide went out. The ships floated away from shore, and when the Viking forces broke and ran late in the afternoon, they found themselves trapped between the Irish army and the sea. The retreating warriors tried to reach their ships, but the tide was coming back in, the water rising, the distance to the ships too great. Men in chain mail, armor that might save your life in combat, discovered it was a death sentence in water. The mail dragged them down, men drowned by the hundreds, weighed down by the very equipment that had made them fearsome warriors. Others tried to flee toward a nearby wood, but the rising tide cut them off. They were cornered against the water and the trees, and Brian's forces massacred them. This is where Twadalbark, Brian's 15-year-old grandson, died. According to the chronicles, he chased fleeing Vikings into the sea, pursuing them with the hot-blooded courage of youth. A wave struck him, throwing him against a fishing weir, a wooden trap for catching fish at the river mouth. Weighed down by his armor and weapons, young Twadalbark drowned in the moment of victory. It was in this chaos of retreat and slaughter that Sigurd, Earl of Orkney, died. Some sources say Murchad killed him personally. What we know for certain is that Sigurd's cursed banner, a raven standard that legend said brought victory, but death to whoever carried it, failed him. 3 men had carried that banner during the battle and been killed. Sigurd finally took it himself, wrapping it around his body. It didn't save him. Mael Morda, the king of Leinster who had started this war, also died in the rout. Whether he fell fighting or was cut down while fleeing, we don't know. But the man who had rebelled against Brian's high kingship didn't live to see the sun set. And then, in those final desperate moments, with victory within reach and the coalition army shattered, a small group of fleeing Vikings, perhaps a dozen men, stumbled upon Brian Boru's tent. The prayer interrupted, the death of Brian Boru. The 73-year-old High King of Ireland knelt in prayer as he had all day. His bodyguards, how many we don't know, tried to stop the Vikings. They failed. Brodia of Mann, the Viking commander who had crossed the Irish Sea to fight for gold and glory, burst into the tent and found an old man on his knees. Did Brian fight back? The legends say he did, that he grabbed a sword and killed 1 or 2 Vikings before Brodia cut him down. The chronicle accounts say simply that Brodia killed him. Either way, the result was the same. On Good Friday, 1014, in the moment of his greatest victory, Brian Boru died. Brodia didn't survive long to celebrate. Brian's warriors fell upon the fleeing Vikings and butchered them. According to some sources, Brodia was killed by Ulf the Quarrelsome, possibly one of Brian's Viking allies. Another account says Brian's men captured Brodia alive and executed him with maximum cruelty, opening his belly and tying his entrails to a tree, then forcing him to walk around it until he died. Medieval justice was creative. As the sun set on Good Friday, around 5:55 p.m., according to those tide calculations, the Battle of Clontarf ended. The Dublin-Leinster Viking coalition was destroyed. The Irish had won. But the victory was written in the blood of its leaders. The arithmetic of destruction. Let's talk about the casualties, because the numbers tell their own story. The Annals of Ulster report that 6,000 Vikings alone were killed. The Annals of Innisfallen put total casualties at 7,000 to 10,000 dead on both sides. Given that the combined armies totaled perhaps 12 to 13,000 men, this means casualty rates of 60–75%, staggering even by medieval standards, where most battles ended with one side breaking and fleeing before such apocalyptic losses. Among Brian's forces killed: Brian Boru himself, High King of Ireland; Murchad mac Brian, his son and heir; Twadalbark, his 15-year-old grandson, drowned in his armor; Canain, Brian's nephew; Domnall mac Diarmata of Corcu Basinde; Mac Bethad mac Muad'Ig of Siraj Luacra; Mael Ruanaid Uah Eidhin, king of Ui Firecrach Aiden. Tadg Uaselig, king of Ui Main. Approximately 4,000 of Brian's 5,000 warriors died. This wasn't a battle that one side won by superior tactics and low losses. This was mutual destruction where Brian's forces simply outlasted the enemy. Among the coalition, forces killed: Mael Morda Mac Murchada, king of Leinster; Sigurd H. Lodverson, Earl of Orkney; Brodia of Mann; Dubgall Mac Amlabe, brother of Sigtrig and Prince of Dublin; Gilla Kirain Mac Glunny Iron, probably Sigtrig's nephew; Platt, the bravest knight of all the foreigners. Approximately 6,000 of the 7,000 coalition fighters died. The Viking forces were virtually annihilated. The Leinster men suffered catastrophic losses. Mael Sechnel's forces from Meath, minimal casualties, make of that what you will. The aftermath, a hollow victory. Brian's body was carried from the battlefield to Swords, north of Dublin, where it was met by the Corb's successor of St. Patrick, the head of the Irish Church, who brought it to Armagh. For 12 days Ireland mourned. The man who had united the island, who had broken the Ui Nail monopoly on power, who had defeated Vikings in battle after battle for nearly 40 years, was buried at Armagh with the honours due an emperor. Alongside him were buried his son Murchad and the severed heads of Cannaing and Mothla, king of the Deisi Muman. Medieval Irish custom preserved the heads of important dead as trophies and relics. Mael Sechnel Mac Domhnaill, the former High King whom Brian had displaced, returned to power. He ruled as High King until his death in 1022, but he never achieved Brian's dominance. Ireland fractured again into competing kingdoms. Brian's surviving sons fought each other for leadership of the Dál G Kais. Donchad Mac Brian, Brian's son by Gormflaith, who was also Sigtrig Silkbeard's mother. Medieval Irish politics were incestuous. Eventually won control, but never claimed the high kingship. Tadg Mac Brian challenged his brother and was killed in 1023 on Donchad's orders. Sigtrig Silkbeard remained king of Dublin until 1036. Far from being destroyed, he was secure enough to go on pilgrimage to Rome in 1028, but Dublin never again challenged for control of Ireland. The Viking kingdom of Dublin became a trading city under Irish overlordship, wealthy, cosmopolitan, but subordinate. Here's the historical irony: Clontarf didn't immediately change anything. Ireland didn't unite. The Vikings didn't disappear. In the short term, Brian's death created more instability, not less. But in the long term, everything changed. How CLONTAF CHNGD warfare, politics, and memory. 1. The military revolution nobody noticed. The Battle of Clontarf demonstrated something crucial about early medieval warfare. Equipment advantage could be overcome by tactical innovation and numerical superiority. The Irish throwing spear tactics countered Viking mail armor effectively enough that it became adopted by other armies. Within a generation, Irish warriors were routinely using massed projectile weapons before close combat, a lesson that would influence Irish military tactics for centuries. 2. The end of Viking expansion. Clontarf marked the effective end of Viking military adventurism in Ireland. Yes, Vikings remained in Dublin, Waterford, and other cities. Yes, Norse-Irish marriages continued. But after 1014, Vikings in Ireland were merchants and settlers, not conquerors. The dream of a Viking kingdom dominating Ireland died with Sigurd and Brodia. Within a century, the Viking Age itself would be over, replaced by settled Norse kingdoms in Scandinavia, converting to Christianity and abandoning the old raid-and trade lifestyle. 3. The birth of Irish nationalism. Here's where Clontarf became larger than history. It became legend. In later centuries, especially during English occupation, Irish writers and patriots remembered Clontarf as the battle where Brian Boru freed Ireland from foreign domination. This wasn't quite true. It was more civil war than nationalist liberation, but the myth became powerful. Brian Boru became the symbol of Irish resistance, the last High King who had united the island before English conquest. 19th-century Irish nationalists saw Clontarf as proof that Ireland could be independent and united. The battle entered folklore, poetry, and national identity. For the Church's victory, the real winners of Clontarf were the Irish monasteries. Brian had supported the Church throughout his reign, and the Church repaid him by making him a legend. The monks who wrote the chronicles portrayed Clontarf as Christian versus pagan, Irish versus foreign, righteous versus evil. This wasn't accurate, but it was effective propaganda. The Church used Brian's memory to strengthen its authority and its claim to represent true Ireland against all foreigners. 5. The succession crisis template. Brian's death without a clear heir established a pattern that would haunt Ireland for centuries. No subsequent High King achieved Brian's dominance. The title of High King became contested, weakened, eventually almost meaningless. When the Anglo-Normans invaded in 1169, they found an Ireland fractured into competing kingdoms with no unified defence. You can draw a direct line from Clontarf's Pyrrhic victory to Ireland's later conquest. The legacy, what historians don't tell you. Modern historians debate whether Clontarf was even particularly important. Some argue it was just another battle in the endless Irish civil wars, that its reputation is inflated by later propaganda, that the Irish versus Vikings narrative is simplistic nonsense. They're right and they're wrong. Yes, Clontarf was more complex than the legends suggest. Yes, there were Vikings on Brian's side and Irish on the coalition side. Yes, the immediate aftermath didn't produce Irish unity or Viking expulsion. But here's what the revisionist historians miss. Historical events become important not just through their immediate effects, but through how they're remembered. Clontarf became the moment that defined Irish possibility, the memory of a time when one man united fractious kingdoms, defeated foreign warriors, and made Ireland imagine itself as a nation rather than a collection of tribes. When Irish rebels in later centuries needed a symbol of resistance, they invoked Brian Boru. When poets wanted to inspire patriotism, they wrote about Clontarf. When Irish immigrants in America and Australia told their children about the old country, they told stories of the High King who died praying on Good Friday while his warriors won Ireland's greatest victory. That power of myth, that shaping of identity through memory, that's as real as any battlefield casualty count. The philosophical weight of Good Friday. Let's end where we began, with an old man praying in a tent. Brian Boru chose to fight on Good Friday, the day commemorating Christ's sacrifice. Whether you believe in divine providence or historical irony, the symbolism is devastating. Brian sacrificed himself, not knowingly, but no less completely, for the dream of Ireland. He won the battle and lost his life, saved his dream and failed to secure its future, became a legend precisely because his victory was incomplete. Think about the mathematics of leadership. 5,000 men followed Brian knowing they faced 7,000 enemies. They followed him because he'd spent 40 years proving he was worth following, because he'd transformed a minor clan into a dynasty, because he'd beaten Vikings and Irish rivals alike, because he represented something larger than tribal loyalty, the possibility of Ireland as one kingdom under one king. 4,000 of those 5,000 died. That's 80% casualties, worse than almost any unit in any modern war. And yet they kept fighting all day, from sunrise to sunset, through exhaustion and wounds and the deaths of their leaders. That's the test of leadership. Can you inspire people to die for your vision? Brian passed that test. He also paid its price. LESSONS for the ages. What does Clontarf teach us across 1,000 years? On leadership, vision isn't enough. Brian united Ireland, but couldn't create institutions strong enough to survive his death. Great leaders don't just achieve great things, they build systems that outlast them. Brian failed that test, which is why Ireland fractured again after 1014. On victory, winning the battle doesn't mean winning the war. Brian's forces crushed the coalition, but lost their king, his heir, and most of their army. Pyrrhic victories are named for King Pyrrhus, who defeated Rome but said another such victory and we are undone. Clontarf fits the definition. On courage, 73 years old, too frail to fight, Brian could have stayed in Munster and let younger men fight his battles. Instead, he came to Clontarf, knelt in prayer behind the lines, and died there. That's courage too, not the courage to fight, but the courage to lead knowing you might not survive to see your victory. On memory, history is written by survivors, but remembered by inheritors. The monks who chronicled Clontarf, the poets who sang of it, the nationalists who invoked it, they shaped Brian Boru into a symbol that was more powerful than the man. That's how humans work. We need heroes, even if the heroes were flawed humans who died in tents while other men did the actual fighting. On inevitability, the Viking Age was ending by 1014. Sweyn Forkbeard had conquered England. The Norse were settling down, converting to Christianity, building kingdoms rather than raiding empires. Clontarf accelerated that trend in Ireland, but didn't create it. Sometimes history has momentum, and individual battles just determine the timing and details of changes that were coming anyway. The end of the story. On April 23, 1014, as the sun set over Dublin Bay and the tide carried Viking corpses out to sea, the surviving Irish warriors gathered their dead. They found Brian in his tent, killed by Brodia's sword. They found Murchad among the piled bodies of Vikings he'd killed. They searched the shoreline for young Twaddlebark and pulled his drowned body from the weir. Sigtrygg Silkbeard watched from Dublin's walls as his allies were destroyed, his brother killed, his Viking reinforcements annihilated. He would remain king of Dublin for another 22 years, but never again challenge for control of Ireland. Mael Sechnil, whose loyalty during the battle remains questioned by historians 1,000 years later, became High King again and ruled until 1022. But he ruled over the same fractured Ireland that Brian had spent his life trying to unite. And in Armagh, monks buried Brian Boru with honor and began writing the chronicles that would transform him from a successful warlord into the symbol of Irish resistance, the last High King, the man who broke Viking power in Ireland forever. The mathematics of Clontarf are brutal: 7 to 10,000 dead, including almost every leader who fought. The political results were ambiguous: short-term chaos, long-term decline of Viking power. The military innovations were subtle: throwing spears versus mail armor, tide timing as tactical factor. But the legacy is 1,000 years of Irish memory, a legend of the old king who prayed on Good Friday while his warriors won Ireland's freedom at the cost of their lives. That's Clontarf, that's Brian Boru. That's how an old man's prayer and a day of slaughter changed Ireland forever, not through what actually happened on that bloody beach, but through what Ireland chose to remember about it. And memory, in the end, shapes history as much as swords ever did. This is the story of the Battle of Clontarf, where courage met calculation, where legend was born in blood, and where an old man's death became a nation's memory.